Hey everybody, welcome to week 14 of PS231. So in the previous lecture we talked about a nice, simple, straightforward model of poker. I thought that was pretty cool. I hope that some of you thought that was pretty cool. It was nice to have an excuse to have a Vegas-themed soundtrack. But, there's more to life than just playing poker. Or is there? What I want to talk about today is a related model that is maybe a little bit more famous than our model of poker from last week. This is going to be a week specifically about the problem of signaling. So the poker model that I showed you is a representative of a larger class of models called signaling models. Signaling models are the most introductory extensive form games of incomplete information. What makes signaling is a couple of things. For starters, there's one-sided incomplete information, so that somebody is the sender of signals, the person with the private information, and one player is the receiver of signals, the person that lacks the information. So in poker, the person that was either staying or raising was the sender of signals, they had the private information. And player 2, that was me throughout the lecture, the receiver of signals doesn't know the true state of the world. Another thing that makes signaling is that the person that has information moves first. So they are the one that has a chance to send a signal. It wouldn't be a signaling model if I didn't know what was happening, and then I just randomly guessed, and then you, who knew the truth, then reacted in some way. That wouldn't be a model of signaling, that would be something else. Now, because signaling is a really important concept in political science, I want to spend another week on it. Again, this is probably the best way for you to get an understanding about what's happening in perfect Bayesian equilibria. And it's also an important concept. And today I want to talk about not just signaling, but the problem of costly signaling, or in particular, the role that costs play in helping signals to have bite. To do that, I'm going to show you the OG signaling model, Spence's job market signaling model. So the idea with Spence's job market signaling model, which is a beautiful model, one of the first models to help us to understand how incomplete information influences market processes, the basic idea goes like this. Suppose that you were deciding whether or not to go to college. It almost sounds applicable to real life. And the idea here is, suppose that college has no effect on whether or not you're going to be a high-capacity worker or a low-capacity worker. We're going to be proceeding on the substantive idea that college doesn't help. Okay? Now, do I think that's true? Obviously not. Do you think that's true? I certainly hope not. But we're going to see whether or not going to college happens, getting more education happens, even if it has no direct effect on whether or not one becomes a good worker. Instead, getting education, putting a line on your resume, will be viewed as an opportunity to send signals about whether you are a high-capacity worker or a low-capacity worker, where there is no additional value add brought in by going to college itself. So whenever you get ready to go get a job, please don't have a panic attack. It happens, it's a stressful thing to think through. You would like to convey credibly the fact that you're a high-capacity worker. Everybody that I've met in this class so far seems like they have a chance to be a high-capacity sort of worker. You deserve good things so far. You've suffered through this class at least. And so, you would like to convey to some HR person, to some hirer, to some company, or to a grad school or something like that, you would like to convey the idea that you're a high-capacity worker. You're a high-capacity, I don't want to say high-capacity person, because there's so many more things to a person than whether or not they have a lot of output. But forgive me if I accidentally have any slips of the tongue. There's a lot that you would like to be able to credibly convey. The question is education a device that allows you to send meaningful signals to employers or to grad schools or anything like that? Is there a way for you to use education to signal your capacity as a worker, even if, on the Homeric assumption, on the probably not true assumption, that education has no direct effect on whether or not you're a high-capacity worker? This is getting provocative, right? Are you feeling provoked? It's weird. You don't think about provocative meaning, oh, and you have provoked me. But I think it's the same root word, is it not? That's a provocative thought. And so what I want to do today is I want to, in some detail, discuss Spence's costly signaling model. The idea here is that the signal, the educational device of sending the message, what makes this a reasonable way to convey information? What makes the conveyance of signals possible through the educational mechanism is the fact that education is costly. Now, it isn't lost on me that when I say education is costly, the first 7 thoughts in your head are going to be about tuition. I completely understand. I hope that you feel you've gotten something remotely close to your money's worth in our interactions together. But I mean something more than just that. I mean it's costly to go in terms of the time that you're putting into this. You've taken yourself off the job market for 4 years, or in my case, 7 years. You've taken yourself off the market to invest in yourself, right? To try to become an educated person, one would hope, whatever that means. And so, you've paid some cost there. Doing problem sets is costly. It takes your time, it takes your energy, it takes calories, right? So the blood that's rushing to your head when you start problem set 14, that's energy that could have been used on something else. And all of that studying and all of that time that you're not on the job market and all of that time that you're not acquiring sort of on-the-job skills, right? All the time that you spend becoming educated at college is time that you couldn't spend on something else. And so there are opportunity costs, there are direct costs, and of course there are the financial costs that I really don't want to diminish. But that's not what I'm talking about throughout today's lecture. It is obviously related, and one can imagine enriching the model to think about cost in a multidimensional way. But I just want to make sure that when I say the word cost, I mean something a little bit, maybe not the elephant in the room sort of thing. And this is going to be a somewhat richer signaling model than what we had in poker last week, but not too much. I think you'll see a lot of the lessons that one learns from our simple poker model from last week will go through as we discuss signaling today. One other thing that's interesting about this signaling model is that it's going to allow for a continuous decision. You're going to be choosing some education level out of several education levels. So whereas in our simple poker model, we had the simplifying device of saying that the person that has a card can either raise or stay. They had a binary choice. Here we'll say, choose some education level. Go to school for 13 years. Go to school for 14 years. Go to school for, I don't even want to talk about how many years in my own case. Right? So we'll be thinking about families of pooling equilibria, families of separating equilibria. We'll be trying to figure out what education levels are supportable in certain kinds of equilibria. So I don't want to get too bogged down in trying to motivate this, because this is something that if it doesn't motivate you now, it'll be motivating you sometime soon. So let's get started with it. So in the A block, I just want to introduce the simple rudiments of Spence's signaling model. So what are the types? What can they choose to do? Who's the receiver of the signal? What can they choose to do? How does this all go, right? So what's the basic framework of what we'll be talking about throughout today's class? You'll see that a lot of the interest on the receiver side, so it was pretty interesting in poker. Whether or not I should fold or call when you bet was a somewhat nuanced decision. Here we're going to try to simplify out most of the interesting things on the receiver of the signal side. We're going to say, well, firms are going to just choose some wage level that comports with the two types, and we'll move on pretty simply from there. So sequential rationality isn't going to be a massive issue here. We're not going to have to worry too much about player 2 the same way that we did last time. That said, we'll also introduce a simplifying lemma in the A block that'll help us to reduce the scope of the analysis very much, so that even though the model is a little bit harder than our poker model was, we'll be able to reduce it to something that isn't too much harder. In the B block, we'll discuss the possibility of separating equilibria, where workers that are high capacity choose one education level, and workers that are low capacity choose another education level. So if this is the case, then one could use education as a meaningful signal, right? So if I'm a high capacity worker and I choose one education level, and lower capacity workers choose a lower education level, then that means, because of the nature of separating equilibria, that I could use the educational mechanism to convey my type perfectly, which is to say the resulting beliefs, the resulting muse, will be 0 and 1, right? So if we have separating equilibria in our model, then that means that the educational mechanism is useful to convey the signal, to credibly convey the information about a worker's competence. However, in the C block, we'll see that there's also a possibility for pooling equilibria. We'll see that under certain conditions, lower capacity workers can mimic the higher capacity workers by choosing an education level that is identical. So if I go to get an associate's degree, if I'm a high capacity worker and I go for an associate's degree, maybe that isn't enough to separate myself, and so somebody else that may be lower capacity than me could get that same associate's degree, and next thing you know, the signal is meaningless, right? Maybe that means that I have to up the ante a little bit. Maybe I have to get involved in an educational auction, or something else might transpire. But we'll see that there is a possibility for the educational mechanism to lack informational bite. And then I'm going to break my promise that there would only be one D block, but given that this is such a similar thing, I think it'll actually be a little bit of help. In the D block, we'll again talk about the possibility of a semi-separating equilibrium, where the low type doesn't get any education, the lower capacity worker doesn't get any education, and the high type saying, oh man, I don't want to have to go to college if I don't have to. Maybe they only get education some of the time. Maybe they mix. So we'll see that, the model that I'll be showing you today, a Nobel Prize winning model, isn't too dissimilar from our cheesy little poker model from last week. It's just that even if you don't become a professional poker player, this model might help you to have something in mind as you go out and begin your professional careers. I certainly hope that it's something you have in mind as you decide whether or not to go to grad school, law school. Do you need to get some other degree, or is it time to get right to it? That's a difficult and nuanced question, and there is no right answer to it. You need to arm yourself with a tool. I'm really looking forward to showing you this tool. Let's get started. Okay, so I want to get started by just introducing the simple rudiments of Spence's job market signaling model. The basic idea of Spence's job market signaling model is the following. There are two players, a worker and a firm. And the idea here is that the worker would like to get a high wage from the firm, and the firm would like to pay a high wage to a high capacity worker. But the worker knows what type of worker they are. I know if I'm a high capacity worker or a low capacity worker, but the firm doesn't know. The firm doesn't know the capacity of the worker. The worker might be the high type. We'll label that theta equals H throughout. Or they might be the low type. We'll label that theta equals L throughout. And again, I just want to repeat the disclaimer that when I say high and low type, I'm meaning this really in the dollars and cents of value that this worker could provide to the firm. There's all sorts of ways to value yourself. What you're worth to a firm is only one of those, okay? I'm not trying to make any larger value statements. And actually, we'll go a little bit further than that with the type. So we'll actually assign the high type a number. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15, some strictly positive number. That'll be H equals 10, H equals 12. We don't know, it's a variable. But that represents the dollars and cents that the worker is worth to the firm. So maybe I'm worth $10 a year to the University of Illinois. And so maybe my number is 10. And maybe you're worth 15 to them. Maybe you're a higher capacity worker than I am. So maybe mine is 10 and yours is 15, in which case I'm the lower type, L equals 10, and you're the higher type, H equals 15, something like that. So there's two kinds of workers, high capacity and low capacity, and we're actually going to put a number on how valuable they would be to the firm. We'll assume that the firm is in a competitive enough environment that the firm would actually like to pay each type of worker what their number is. So if you're the high capacity worker and H equals 15, then if I'm the firm, I would like to pay you $15. And if you're the lower capacity worker and maybe L equals 8, then I would like to pay you $8. Okay, so we'll assume that there's enough competition in the labor market in question that the firm has no choice but to pay the entire amount for the type of worker. Of course, the firm doesn't know what type of worker they're up against, right? So they don't know what kind of worker we have. They have only probabilistic expectations about that. In particular, let's refer to the probability that the worker is a high type as P, and the probability that the worker is a low type is 1 minus P. So that's our type space. These are our two players, and that's our type space. So we can begin to think about this now as something like a game. So at the beginning of time, nature makes a move. Nature makes the first choice, and they decide whether or not we have a high capacity worker or a low capacity worker. So the high capacity worker, that happens with probability P, and the low capacity worker happens with probability 1 minus P, where again, that's somewhere between 0 and 1, strictly so. So nature determines the type of worker that we're up against. Remember, the types determine a number. The types determine a number. Now, in our previous signaling model, then you could sort of like opt out of the model by staying, or you could signal by raising. Here, the idea is you don't have much of a choice. You're going to send a signal no matter what you do. So after the type has been decided, the worker, player W, that's you, the worker has to choose some level. The worker makes one choice of an education level. They choose some E greater than or equal to 0. So they choose some education level E greater than or equal to 0, which means that I have an Assassin's Creed hoodie on my hands again. Okay? So they make some choice. They're going to say, I go to school for 0 years. I go to school for 1,000 years. I go to school for 10 years. Something like that. So they're choosing some education level out of this slider. They're setting a slider strategically about how much education to obtain. And the idea is that this might convey some information about what kind of worker you are, but it also induces disutility. So going to college is a pain. Looking at my face an hour and a half a day every week is a pain. Somebody isn't doing that. Somebody else isn't putting up with all this crap, right? Somebody's just out there on the job market now. So next thing's next. The firm observes the signal. They see how much education was chosen, but they don't know which of these worlds we live in. So once again, we have an information set thing going on, but it is no longer the case that it's like, now it's like, where are these two people on each of these two hoodies, right? So there's the high capacity workers hoodie, there's the low capacity workers hoodie, right? And all that happens is the firm sees some education level. They get a resume. The HR person sees a resume. So they see one and only one chosen level of education. They don't know whether or not this educated person is a high capacity worker or a low capacity worker. And then they choose some wage. They will choose some wage, W. And throughout, we'll just say that the wage that they offer is exactly equal to their expectation about whether they're up against a high capacity worker or a low capacity worker. So in particular, if their belief that they have a high capacity worker is mu, so mu is their belief, then we'll say that the wage that the firm is going to pay is mu h, mu times the high wage, plus 1 minus mu times the low wage. So they would like to pay the high capacity worker H dollars. They would like to pay the low capacity worker L dollars. If they know perfectly, if they have a mu of 0 or 1, then they can just choose H or L accordingly. But if they have only some intermediate belief, if they don't know what kind of worker they have, then they'll choose some wage level that's in between and that reflects this uncertainty. We really won't be talking too much about the firm's decision. The more important thing is what the firm's beliefs are, and we know how to obtain those via Bayes' rule. But the real key here is that the high capacity type and the low capacity type are going to vary in terms of the costs that they pay, right? So let's zoom in on the high capacity type. So the high capacity workers' payoff for their education level, for the amount of education that they choose, is their wage, which is mu times h, plus 1 minus mu times L, right? So that's their wage, minus E over H. So we're going to use their capacity level, which is the higher one, to scale the disutility. We're going to say that these two kinds of workers have different marginal costs. Their marginal cost of education is lower. The idea here is that the high type is going to have a lower marginal cost of education than the low capacity worker is. The high capacity worker has a low marginal cost. They don't mind going to college as much, right? Homework is easier for them or something like that. And you could enrich this model if you want to. We have a lot of simplifying assumptions happening, but the basic idea is, the wage correlates with the marginal cost. So people that you would like to pay more to at your firm, more often than not, are people for whom problem sets aren't such a big deal. So in this simplified model, that correlation is perfect, so that the wage that I would like to pay you is directly related to your marginal costs. Of course, in reality, that isn't true, but this is going to give you a nice simple characterization about the job market. For the low capacity worker, it's just the same logic. So it's mu times H plus 1 minus mu times L minus E minus the education level that they have divided by L. Now, because the low capacity worker has a smaller L, that means that this cost is bigger. So the high capacity, let's say that the low capacity is at $1 and the high capacity is at $2, right? So L equals 1 and H equals 2. Just to say that. And let's say that both types went to school for 10 units of education, 10 years. The idea here is that the high capacity worker pays a lower cost for that, right? So they pay 10 divided by 2 equals 5 units of happiness as a cost, whereas the low capacity worker pays 10 divided by 1 equals 10 units of happiness as a cost. So the real magic here is going to be in figuring out how the differences in these capacities interplay with the differences in the education levels, interplay with the beliefs that the firm comes up with in response to the signal. And that's why this mu plays such a big role, right? So mu is a very big deal. Mu is going to be driving the entire result, the belief, the subjective belief that the firm assigns to having a high capacity worker, right? Which we know could be 0, it could be 1, it could be P, it could be something in between. So what we're interested in knowing is, do these two types of workers choose the same amount of education, or they choose different amounts of education? If they choose the same amount of education, then that means that the educational signaling mechanism does not transmit information. So if everybody goes to college, then the fact that you went to college conveys no meaning, right? Just the same way that if everybody raised, then the fact that you raised sends no signal about how good your card is. So if everybody gets the same amount of education, if they pool on a particular educational level, if they pool, then that means that there isn't any bite to the informational mechanism of education. However, if they separate, if I choose one education level and you choose a different education level, then that means that the informational mechanism of education is perfect, so that the firm can draw perfect inferences about what kind of worker that they have sitting at this interview. Before we move on to that analysis, I just want to simplify things quite a bit by noticing that the high type, the high capacity worker, will never choose an educational level strictly less than the low capacity worker. It will never be the case that E sub H is strictly less than E sub L. To show this, I just going to have a little aside. Let's let mu sub H be the belief that the firm draws after observing educational level E sub H. And let's let mu sub L be the belief that the firm assigns to the high type after observing educational level E sub L. Now I can write out the expected utility. Let's think about the high type. So right now, the high type, the high capacity worker who has chosen educational level E sub H, right now, what they're getting from that is mu sub H, the belief after observing E sub H, times the high wage, plus 1 minus mu sub H, times the low wage L, minus E sub H over H. Okay, so they're getting their wage, which depends on this educational level that they've chosen, and the subsequent belief. So they choose that, and then they pay this E sub H over H. That's their utility right now. That's their utility for having E sub H. Notice also that the same thing goes for the low type. So that right now the low type is getting mu sub L, the belief of the high type after seeing the low level of education, times H, plus 1 minus mu sub L times L, minus E sub L over L. That's what they're getting. Okay, so that denominator, it depends perfectly on the type. That isn't going to change. That doesn't change. That the marginal cost term doesn't change. Now let's just observe that if this were an equilibrium, okay, and we're only going to be studying equilibria, so in any equilibrium, it must be true that the high type doesn't want to deviate to the low type's amount of education, and the low type doesn't want to deviate to the high type's amount of education. So in other words, we're going to get two inequalities. We're going to get two inequalities that must be true in any equilibrium. The first inequality is that what the high type is getting, mu sub H times H, plus 1 minus mu sub H times L, minus E sub H over H. That's right now what they're getting for choosing their own education level. That's got to be greater than or equal to what they would get if they chose the low type's amount of education, which is just mu sub L times H, plus 1 minus mu sub L times L, minus E sub L, the lower amount of education, divided by H. The high type's marginal costs are lower. So this is inequality number one. This must be true in any equilibrium. It must be true that the high type is happy with their amount of education. The same goes for the low type. So it has to be true that what the low type is getting for playing E sub L, that has to be greater than or equal to what they would be getting for playing E sub H. So it needs to be the case that mu sub L times H plus 1 minus mu sub L times L, the wage for for playing education level low, minus E sub L over L. That's the low type's cost for choosing the low type's amount of education. That has got to be greater than or equal to mu sub H times H plus 1 minus mu H times L minus E sub H, the higher amount of education, the high type's amount of education, divided by L. Their costs remain the same no matter what. So because these two inequalities must be true in any equilibrium, it must also be true that if we add them together, then the resulting inequality must also be true. So I'm just going to take the left-hand side of the first inequality and add it to the left-hand side of the second inequality. And that sum must be greater than or equal to the right-hand side of the first inequality plus the right-hand side of the second inequality. Okay, so I'm just going to add these two things together and get a new inequality. Now, a lot of things are going to drop out. There's a lot of things that are the same on one side or the other. And you do some rearranging, and you can do this in the comfort of your own home. I encourage you to. And it works out to EH minus EL times 1 minus L minus 1 over H. That's got to be greater than or equal to 0. Now, because the low capacity type's number is lower, then 1 minus L is bigger than 1 minus H, which means that the high capacity type's education level must be at least as high as the low capacity type's. Otherwise, that difference would fall apart. Right? So we need EH minus EL to be greater than or equal to 0, which means that EH has got to be greater than or equal to EL. So in any equilibrium, the high type goes to school for at least as long as the low type does. It is never the case that the low type goes to school for strictly more time than the high type does. So because of that simplifying assumption, we'll be able to think about this a lot more simply. The real question is going to be, is EH equal to EL, pooling, or is EH strictly greater than EL, separating? So this is our simple model of job market signaling. It's as simple as it gets. Education serves no purpose, no direct purpose. Notice that all that education does in the worker's utility functions is induce disutility. All that you do with education is pay costs. There is no benefit to having a high E. If you look at these expected utilities, the only reason that education improves your utility is if it improves your mu. The only way that education can help you in this model, I'm not saying this is generally true, in this model, in this fable, the only reason that one would get an education is to bump that mu up. You want to bump that mu up. You want to make people think that you're a high capacity worker so that you get H rather than L as your wage. Because the only direct effect that choosing a higher educational level does to your utility, the only direct effect of that, what's the direct effect? Costs. And you're like, no shit. You're like, no shit, fat man. I knew that all that I got out of education was costs. Nevertheless, you might still want to go. We're going to have to talk about that when we get over to the B block. All right, so here we are. It's time for us to figure out whether this model admits a separating equilibrium. Is it possible for the high type worker to choose a strictly higher amount of education than the low type worker? So let's suppose that the high type worker chooses some E sub H, strictly greater than 0. So they're going to choose some education level. It might be 1, it might be 2, it might be 14 years, it might be 18 years, however long. I don't want to talk about how long it's been for some of us. So let's just suppose that the high type chooses some strictly positive education level, E sub H. We'll try to figure out which of those is allowable later on. But for now, all that we know is E sub H is strictly positive. They choose some high amount of education. And we'll suppose that the low type of worker chooses E sub L equals 0. Let's just suppose, because the only direct effect of education here is cost. Therefore, if we're playing a separating equilibrium, if I'm the low type worker, and I'm going to be revealed to be the low type worker because I don't go to school as much as the high type worker. If we're playing a separating equilibrium, and I went to school for a little bit of time, Let's say that I went to school for a little bit of time. Now, I'm going to get the low wage because it's a separating equilibrium. And I can either get that low wage for paying a little bit of money for EL or just going not at all. If I was going to get the low wage, I'd rather get the low wage and not have gone to school for it. If I knew for sure I was going to get the low wage in a separating equilibrium, I'm the low type worker. And we're playing a separating equilibrium. I'm going to be outed as the low type worker in the separating equilibrium if it exists. Therefore, I'd rather get that for free. If I knew for sure I was going to get the low wage, I wouldn't waste any time at school. So suppose for now, EH strictly greater than 0, EL exactly equal to 0. Okay, so now we have the separating equilibrium. We have the separating strategy, E sub H and E sub L equals 0. Now let's think about what that means for mu. What is the firm's belief? What beliefs do they assign? What is the mu that they assign? Well, this is actually kind of nuanced, all right? So the only things that the firm knows a couple of things. The firm knows that if they observe education level E sub H, they know that the high type, that the only person that's playing E sub H is the high type. So their mu H is going to be 1. If they see the high amount of education, if I'm going to school for 14 years when I'm the high type, and then somebody sees a resume that involves 14 years of education, then that firm will say, oh, well, this is what high types do. Therefore, I know for sure this is a high type. Mu sub H, the probability that I assign to a high type, conditional on seeing the high amount of education, is 1. We could put that through Bayes' rule if you wanted to. The probability, it's the high type, conditional on seeing E sub H. Well, it's the probability that you have the high type, that's P, times the probability of E sub H, conditional on the high type, that's 1. The high type is playing E sub H for sure. Right? Over that, plus the probability it's a low type, 1 minus P, times the probability of seeing E sub H conditional on it being the low type. Well, the low type isn't going to school for EH years, therefore that's 0. So we get P over P plus 0, that's just 1. Mu equals 1. So if the firm saw the high signal, they would know for sure that it was the high type and assign a probability of 1. The same goes for the low type. So if the firm observes 0 years of education, they know for sure that that is the low type. Right? They know for sure that's the low type. They say to themselves, this is the low type. I'm going to give a wage of L. I'm going to set mu equal to 0. Mu sub L equals 0. Again, we can put that through Bayes' rule if you'd like. What's the probability of it being the high type conditional on seeing the low signal? E equals 0. That's probability of the high type, P, times probability of seeing E sub 0 conditional on it being the high type. That is 0. The high type isn't going to school for 0 years. Over that, which is 0, plus the probability of the low type, 1 minus P, times the probability of seeing E equals 0 conditional on it being the low type, which is 1. So you get 0 over 0 plus 1 minus P, which is 0. Now, I'm going to leave open the beliefs that the firm will have for any other education level. So right now, there are 2 education levels. 0, which is what the low type is doing, and E sub H, which is what the high type is doing. But this was an Assassin's Creed hoodie. There's an infinite number of educational levels that I could have chosen, right? It wasn't just stay or raise. It was choose a number of years to go to school for, and this is continuous. So what's the right way to specify beliefs for all the educational levels that don't get hit, which is a lot of them, like an infinite number of them. We'll talk about that momentarily. But just to have in mind that all that we've done so far is pin down the beliefs from seeing E sub H and 0. So let's think about the deviations. Let's just think about possible deviations. In order for the high type to not want to deviate, it has to be true that what they're getting right now has got to be higher than what they would get for deviating to the low type's effort level of 0. So in other words, it has to be the case that mu H times H plus 1 minus mu H times L, that's their wage, minus EH over H has got to be greater than or equal to mu L times H plus 1 minus mu L times L minus 0. No costs for being that person. Well, we know from the mu's that we just discussed that mu H equals 1 and mu L equals 0, right? So in other words, it's got to be the case that H minus E sub H over H, that is the utility for the high type, that's got to be higher than L. So it needs to be the case that H minus E sub H over H has got to be greater than or equal to L. Otherwise, the high type would want to deviate and act like the low type. Similarly, the low type doesn't want to deviate. We need it to be the case that the low type doesn't want to go to school for however long the high type is going, right? So it needs to be the case that what they're getting, which is just L, that's got to be greater than or equal to what they would get if they deviated, which is H. If they deviated, they'd get the high wage, minus E sub H over L. They still have to pay the costs. They can fake it till they make it, but they're going to pay costs along the way. Chewy says hi. So notice something about these two inequalities, right? So there's something really interesting. If we use these two inequalities together, we're really in sleuth mode right now, right? So if we use these two inequalities together, we're going to learn something interesting, okay? So notice that for the low type worker to not want to deviate, again, that told us that we needed L to be greater than or equal to H minus E sub H over L. If you work all that out, that means that E sub H has got to be greater than or equal to L, the low type's value, economic value, financial value to the firm, times H minus L. The gap and their usefulness, right? However much the H worker is worth more, whatever the gap in their financial value to the firm is, whatever the gap in their value is, that times L. We know that E sub H has got to be greater than or equal to that. Okay, that's just, otherwise the low type would want to deviate. If E sub H isn't high enough, if you didn't go to school for long enough, then the low type worker will want to mimic you. They won't want to stay at E sub L equals 0. So this must be true in order for the low type worker to not want to mimic the high type worker. Okay, so that's the first big lesson here. E sub H, in order for a separating equilibrium to happen, in order for education to be a meaningful signal, the amount that you go must be greater than or equal to some number that reflects what it would take to keep the low type worker to not want to mimic you. However, if the educational level is too high, then the high capacity worker will say to themselves, this wasn't worth it. I just wish I had gone to school for 0 years and gotten a low wage. So in other words, if we rearrange the high type worker's incentive compatibility condition, we learn that E sub H must be less than or equal to H times H minus L. So now we have bounds. We have a lower bound. The high type has to go to school long enough to keep the low type at bay, but not so long that they regret what they did. That's pretty cool to begin with. So right now, we found an entire range of acceptable, here's an entire range of acceptable educational levels that are low enough that the high type worker doesn't wish that they had gone and lived on a commune, but high enough that it keeps the low type workers away. This is already getting provocative. So any one of these education levels could work. The only thing that we haven't done is talk about what would happen if either type of worker deviated to some other education level other than 0 or E sub H. We need to think about what the mu for every one of these possible education levels is. All that we know right now is that a mu equals 0. The belief is 0. If we observe 0 units of education, then we will infer that that's the low type worker for sure, and thus that mu sub L equals 0. And all that we know is that for whatever this education level is, whatever this E sub H is that lives in this range, whatever that E sub H is that lives in this acceptable range, all that we know for sure is that that level of education yields mu sub H equals 1. But what about all these other ranges? What about all these other education levels? What's the firm's belief for every one of those? Well, let's go with something straightforward and simple. Let's say that the firm says, if I see an education level strictly less than E sub H, whatever that E sub H is, choose one E sub H in this range of acceptable education levels. Choose one and only one. and we'll say that the firm is thinking to themselves, if I see 0, I know it's the low type for sure. If I see E sub h, I know it's the high type for sure. If I see any education level strictly less than E sub h, I will set my beliefs at 0. I will infer that it is the low type for sure. And if I see any education level strictly greater than E sub h, I will assume that it is the high type for sure. I'll set mu equal to 1. So in other words, now I've got a belief structure. I have a belief structure for the firm that includes not just what happens on the path, not just 0 and not just E sub h. Now I've got a belief for every possible education level. These are the off-path beliefs. We can specify them however we want to. If you ask about this in class, I'll show you other belief structures that will support an equilibrium just as much. This one is intuitive. It's also easy to compute. This is an easy one to play with. So in other words, the belief is going to be 0 up to E sub h, and then 1 from E sub h onward. And we have to specify those. We don't have a Bayes rule to work with because we'd have to divide by 0. That's all off-path beliefs. None of these things actually happen. These are all hypotheticals. All that we know right now is that the low type is choosing 0, and the high type is choosing 1 and only 1 E sub h in this acceptable range. Now let's think about other deviations. We've thought about deviations to each other. Does the low type wish that they could deviate? Well, if they deviated to anything strictly less than E sub h, they would still be thought of as the low type. They would get the same exact wage of L, and they would have to pay a cost for it. They don't want to deviate there. We know that they don't want to deviate to any E sub h that's in this happy range because that's too much for them. That's too much education given their marginal costs. So they don't want to do that, right? So the low type of worker is content as they sit. Okay? So they don't want to deviate. They don't want to deviate to anything in between. They don't want to deviate to E sub h. They certainly don't want to deviate to anything strictly greater than E sub h. So the low type is happy. What about the high type? Well, if they deviated to anything lower, they'd be viewed as the low type of worker for sure. That's the beliefs that we specified. They'd get L. We know for sure that what they're getting at their current education level, because it's in this range, right now that's not too high. So they would rather work as they're working rather than get the low wage for sure. So they're happy in that direction. If they deviated to some higher amount of education, well, they would just wind up getting the same wage and having more schooling to pay for. They don't want to do that. They don't want to deviate. So we have identified an infinite range of equilibria. This game has an infinite number of separating equilibria. And they all have the following form. The low type goes to school for 0 years. They choose E sub L equals 0. The high type goes to school for E sub h years, where E sub h is some number greater than or equal to L times h minus L, and less than or equal to h times h minus L. The firm believes that if they see an education level of 0, they believe it's the low type for sure. If they observe an education level strictly greater than 0, but strictly less than EH, they believe it's the low type for sure. If they observe E sub h or higher, they believe it's the high type for sure. So everywhere in this range supports an equilibrium. Notice that this range gets bigger and bigger as h minus L gets bigger and bigger, right? So the size of this gap, the size of the range of acceptable education levels that support separating, this is just h minus L squared, right? So that's this gap. That's h times h minus L times h minus L. That's just h minus L squared. So this gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger as h gets bigger and bigger relative to L. So the more that the high type, the bigger their gap in proficiency over the low type, the bigger the range of acceptable separating equilibria becomes. So we've seen that even if education serves 0 direct purpose, and even if education is costly, and in fact, precisely because education is costly, but education is costly at differing rates to different kinds of people, this allows it to be a useful, credible way to convey information about one's type. An interesting question is that the only ending to this story? We're going to see that that isn't the case over in the C block. So we just saw over in the B block that under certain conditions, the high type can use education as a credible way to convey information, to distinguish themselves from other workers. An interesting question is, does that always have to happen? And the way that we would answer that is by wondering whether there are any pooling equilibria. Do there exist any equilibria in this model where both types of worker choose the same education level? We'll just call it E star. So we'll just say that the high type and the low type choose the same educational level. They both choose E star. We'll just call that E star throughout because it's not going to depend on the type. Now, what does that mean for the belief? What does that mean that the firm will believe? Well, we can use Bayes' rule if we want to. So their belief when they observe E star, we'll call that mu star. We can work that out. So by Bayes' rule, the belief that it's the high type conditional on seeing the E star, this one unified signal. Well, that's P, the probability of having the high type, times the probability that the high type plays E star, that's 1, over that same thing, plus 1 minus P, the probability of the low type, times the probability that the low type plays E star. Well, that's 1 in this strategy, and that works out to P. So the prior goes through. Once again, because of a pooling strategy, because everybody is doing the same thing, the signal sends no new information. You have the same exact beliefs that you had prior to observing the signal if you're the firm. So what does that mean for the wages? Well, that means that the high type, their utility, is P times H plus 1 minus P times L minus E star over H. So it's the wage that you get, which is now somewhere in between the highest wage and the lowest wage. Now, the wage that you get reflects both the gap between high and low workers and also the relative likelihood of high and low workers. And the low type is getting P times H plus 1 minus P times L minus E star over L. So they pay a higher cost. So their utility is not as high as the high types, but they get the same wage. They get the same wage, but they paid higher costs. Now, for us to think about deviations, we have to think about all of the possible education levels and what belief the firm would assign. Well, I'm going to choose the absolute simplest, not the most intelligent or the most reasonable sounding, but I'm going to choose the absolute simplest beliefs that I could come up with. So let's think about the belief structure. Right now, we know that if the education level is exactly equal to E star, then the appropriate belief is P. So if you see an education level of E star, then by Bayes' rule, as we just derived, you believe that you have the high type with probability P. But what are the appropriate beliefs, or what are beliefs that you could have for any other education level? Well, let's just keep it super simple, and say that if any education level is chosen other than E star, lower than E star, higher than E star, I don't care. I don't really care about getting this all the way right. There are other strategies that could do this, but I just want to keep this as easy as possible. Let's just say that for any other education level, the belief is 0. You think that if it's too little education, low type worker. Too much education, low type worker. Right? So we got 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, P, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 as the beliefs. And so consequently, the wage that gets paid is L, 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 PH plus 1 minus PL, L, 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 L. So in other words, if you deviate to anything else, if you deviate to any other education level right now, we're going to suppose that you get the low wage for sure. Consequently, we only need to consider deviating to an education level of 0, because that's the cheapest way to get the low wage. I don't want to have to consider L minus some other education level over H, or L over some other minus some other education level over L. I don't want to have to consider that. Let's just say they could deviate to 0 and get L for sure. So right now, the high type at E star is getting PH plus 1 minus PL minus E star over H. And we need that to be greater than or equal to L, which is what they would get if they deviated over to 0. Similarly, the low type is getting pH plus 1 minus P times L minus E star over L, which is the higher cost. That's got to be greater than or equal to L. So if one is true, then the other is true, right? So we need the low type to not want to deviate over to 0. So our official condition for a pooling equilibrium, given this belief structure on the firm side, is it needs to be true that pH plus 1 minus P times L minus E star over L, the higher cost, that has to be greater than or equal to L, the wage that you get for going to school for 0 years. Well, this condition gives us an upper bound for how big E star can be, right? So if you take this condition and you rearrange it, you learn that E star must be less than or equal to P times L times H minus L. So that's an upper bound for how big the education level could be in a pooling equilibrium. Now, when does that bound get easier? That bound gets easier and easier and easier to achieve, right? So when is this range getting bigger? This range is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as 3 things happen. 1, as the probability that the high type happens. So if P goes to 1, if P gets bigger and bigger and bigger, if I think as a prior belief that you're very likely to be a high type worker, then there will be more and more and more possibilities for pooling equilibria. It'll be easier and easier and easier for the low type to mimic the high type. That's what pooling is in this game. Pooling is the low type acting like the high type and getting some of that wage, right? So there are more and more and more pooling equilibria as the prior belief of high type gets higher and higher and higher. So the more faith the HR person has in you, the easier it is to mimic. It also gets easier and easier and easier for the low type to mimic as L increases, which is to say, as they get more and more capacity. So as the absolute capacity of the low type increases, it becomes easier and easier for them to mimic the high type. And then finally, the sort of interesting and counterintuitive one, it gets easier and easier and easier for the high type, for the low type to mimic the high type, as their spread increases, as H minus L gets bigger, as the high type becomes more valuable than the low type. So there's an absolute effect for the low type, and then a relative effect for the high type. So these 3 factors determine how likely it is to observe a pooling equilibrium, how likely it is for everybody to get the same amount of education. Now that's somewhat unique to this particular belief structure, these off-path beliefs that we specified, but it's not that married to it. So that's an interesting way to think about the conditions under which resumes become more and more homogeneous. As we believe that people are high capacity, it becomes easier and easier for homogeneous resumes to happen. As we increase the capacity of the low capacity worker, it becomes easier and easier for homogeneous resumes to happen. And as the high type becomes relatively more valuable than the low type, it becomes easier and easier for homogeneous resumes to happen. That's pretty interesting. The way that those 3 things all work together in this interesting way to determine just how many pooling equilibria there are, just how many different amounts of education could be the amount of education that we all pooled on. High school, college, grad school. So we could pool on 0, we could pool on 1, we could pool on 2, ... We could pool on any E star that's less than or equal to P times L times H minus L. You might be a little bit thrown off by this off-path belief thing, and it's understandable. It's a little bit weird, the fact that we said the firm will assume that any kind of worker that doesn't go to school for exactly E star years must be the low capacity worker. Again, there would have been some others that are a little bit harder to think through and have more algebra involved. But this just goes to show the importance of off-path beliefs and signaling models in general. You know, if I have a lot of different ways that I could convey information, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, some big range of education levels, if I have some big range of available signals, then that means I have to be thinking through how the receiver of my signal will think through all of the counterfactual worlds that we don't observe, right? So the logic of the hypothetical worlds is just as important here, if not a little bit more so, than it was in regular old extensive form game day. It's just here you don't see them. You know, it's not like some big branch of a tree. Now it's more like we have to think through. We just have to look for it. That's in our head more than it is on the screen. Okay? And I know that's annoying because the screen is really helpful. And so you might have to stare at the page a little bit. And for that, I'm sorry. But once you see what we're doing, it'll click, I think. Okay? And you'll have one more chance for that to happen when we look for semi-separating equilibria over in the D block. All right, we have one more class of equilibria to think through. So consider the following situation. Suppose that the low type of worker, just like they were in the separating equilibrium, chose an education level of 0. Okay, and now suppose that you were a high type worker. If you knew that low type workers were not going to school, if you knew that they were choosing 0 years of education. Now, it's true that if you chose, according to the separating analysis that we did over in the B block, it's true that if you went to school for some amount of time, you'd reveal yourself to be the high type worker and you'd get the high wage and that might be enough, right? So we had a range of possible levels of school that you could use as a pure strategy to be able to distinguish yourself as the high type worker without it being so much that you wish that you had been a low type worker yourself. But that's not the only way that you could do this. Consider the following bet hedging strategy. Suppose that you're the high type worker. Sometimes you choose some education level, call it E sub H, and sometimes you choose 0. So sometimes you don't go to school, and sometimes you do. The question is, what years of education could you use for that? What are the possible mixing probabilities, and how much school would you go to conditional on that mixing probability? So let's say that the low type worker chooses E sub L equals 0. The high type worker will set their education level at 0 with probability Q. They're going to mix. So Q% of the time, they don't go to school. And 1 minus Q% of the time, they choose some E sub H strictly greater than 0. So Q% of the time, they act just like the low type worker. And 1 minus Q% of the time, they go to school for some amount of time. We'll try to figure out how long that could be. Well, let's think about the appropriate beliefs. Okay, so if the firm saw E sub H, if they saw that strictly positive amount of education that the high type is choosing some of the time, 1 minus Q% of the time. So if they saw that, which is an if, but if they saw that, they would know it's the high type for sure because only the high type is doing that. Let's go through Bayes' rule for that. So the probability of it being the high type, conditional on observing an educational level of E sub H, is the probability that it's the high type, that's still just P, times the probability that we see that education level conditional on it being the high type, which is 1 minus Q. So we have P times 1 minus Q over P times 1 minus Q plus the probability that it's the low type, that's still just 1 minus P, times the probability that the low type chooses this education level E sub H, which is 0. So if the firm sees the education level E sub H, then they assign a mu of 1. That P times 1 minus Q over P times 1 minus Q is 1. So they assign a probability of 1. So in other words, whenever in that 1 minus Q% of the time that the high type chooses a strictly positive education level, they get the wage H. They get the high wage for sure, right? So they get that high wage for sure. What about when the firm observes 0 education? What is the appropriate belief? What's the correct mu to assign after seeing an education level of 0? Now, this is really nuanced. It's okay if you don't get it the first time. It's okay. Well, that works out to the probability that it's the high type, that's just P, times the probability of observing 0 education from the high type. That is Q. So the numerator is P times Q over P times Q plus the probability of observing the low type, that's still just 1 minus P, times the probability of observing a 0 education level conditional on it being the low type. Well, in this strategy, that is 1. So that works out to P times Q over P times Q plus 1 minus P. So in other words, the employer, their correct belief upon observing the firm, when they observe zero education, their updated belief is P times Q over P times Q plus 1 minus P. That's a mouthful, huh? And so that the wage that they offer is P times Q over P times Q plus 1 minus P times H plus 1 minus P over P times Q plus 1 minus P times L. That's the wage that you get for being that's the wage that you get at zero. So if you don't go to school at all, the wage that you get is P times Q over P times Q plus 1 minus P times H plus 1 minus P over P times Q plus 1 minus P times L minus no cost. You didn't go to school. And if whenever the high type chooses that positive amount of education, then the wage that they get is H minus E sub H over H. Notice that the high type worker would only be willing to mix if they were indifferent between those two options. In other words, these two things have got to be equal. And so what we wind up with is something that's a function of Q on one side. All of those mixing probabilities work into those Bayes rules. So in terms of the education level that you get at zero, the mixing probability stars in the show quite a bit. And over here, it's about the effort level that you choose. How high is your effort level? So in other words, the E, the effort level, and the Q, the mixing probability, they have to match just right. There's an infinite range of EQ combinations, effort level mixing probability combinations, that will render the high type indifferent between these two things that they're mixing over. So right now, what's happening? The low type is setting E equal to 0 for sure, and they are getting the low wage, and the low wage is P times Q over P times Q plus 1 minus P times H plus 1 minus P over P times Q plus 1 minus P times L. That is what the low type worker is getting. The high type worker is getting that with probability Q. And with probability 1 minus Q, they're getting H minus E sub H over H. The last thing we need to do for this is to figure out whether anybody wants to deviate to some other education level that isn't 0 or E sub H. And the easiest way to make sure that doesn't happen is to say, well, just assume it's the low type worker no matter what. And that means there won't be any profitable deviations. So in other words, there exists an infinite number of semi-separating equilibria where the low capacity worker doesn't go to school and the high capacity worker goes to school sometimes and doesn't go to school sometimes. Now, which of these you want to go play? That's up to you, but at least now you know about them. So what do we talk about today? We talked about the problem of costly signaling. How do you use some mechanism that costs resources to you? And how do you use the fact that there's variety in how costly a given action is? How do you use heterogeneity and marginal costs of actions? How do you use that to be able to distinguish yourself from other people, right? So when we're embedded in strategic environments with informational asymmetries, when you're on the job market and you go to LinkedIn or one of the job boards or something, when you go to one of those, how do you distinguish yourself from the other workers? Is there a way for you to distinguish yourself from other candidates for the jobs that you would like? And we saw that sometimes yes, sometimes no, and sometimes maybe, right? So we saw both separating equilibria where you could use education to distinguish yourself. We saw pooling equilibria where you could not use education to distinguish yourself. And we saw semi-separating equilibria where sometimes you use education to distinguish yourself. It's a blessing and a curse, right? This model can pin down, it can support a wide variety of outcomes. There's an infinite number of separating equilibria. There's an infinite number of pooling equilibria. There's an infinite number of semi-separating equilibria. This game generates a lot of equilibria, many of which come in very different qualitative flavors in terms of the substantive punchline. Sometimes education is a way to send signals, and sometimes it isn't. Now, if the workers did not differ in their ability. If H was exactly equal to L, then this all breaks down, right? So the reason that costly signaling is an okay mechanism to send signals is the fact that there is variety in the marginal costs. That variety in the marginal costs means that the two types are different in ways that correlate with the wage. Now, this might seem like a very cynical and bean county way to think about an important thing like choosing an education level. The defining feature of this model isn't just that informational aspect, though. It's the fact that what makes this such a catchy model, the reason, like a pop song, that this one sticks in your head, is that education has no direct benefit in this model. Education doesn't make you a better worker. Education doesn't make you a better person. Education doesn't provide you any consumption utility because you enjoyed reading a poem, right? In this model, we have stripped all of those away. We've said, even in the absence of direct benefits, be they occupational, be they psychic, whatever those differences are, we're not even going to care about them. And we're still going to see that people go to school even if it has no benefit. We don't do that because we think that education has no benefit. We just want it to be the case that the reason that somebody goes to school is not those benefits. Even if we strip them away, even if we tie a hand behind our back, we can make some people go to school and others not. Or even if we tie our hand behind our back, we can have everybody go to school. And they go to school even though there's no benefits in this model. Those utility functions had no direct benefits of education, which is how you're feeling right now, I'm sure. However, I hope that you think that that feature of the model is not true, and it's with that in mind that I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. When I first got taught this model, I didn't know there was any game theory until I got to grad school. I hadn't heard of game theory until I got to grad school. I hadn't heard of regression either. One reason that I teach you the way that I teach you is because of how awful I felt when I got to grad school and I hadn't heard of anything. And I know that most of you aren't going to go to grad school and anything like what I did, but it just seems to me that an important part of an education in political science is at least being minimally exposed to some of these important concepts and being shown substantive lessons in a principled, rigorous way. So when I got to grad school, I got taught this model. And one of my cohort mates in grad school went to a liberal arts college for undergrad. I didn't go to a liberal arts college. And, he was able to evaluate the model on its own terms, and he was a brilliant guy, so it wasn't very hard for him to do so. But you could also tell that it rubbed him a little bit the wrong way to have written down this model at all. You could tell that he wasn't on board with this imagine education had no direct benefit idea. And even though he understood the rhetorical trick of it, I think that he didn't like some of the normative flavor. And I would agree with him on that. But here's a slightly different interpretation. So suppose that you were playing as if you were in Spence's model of job market signaling. Suppose that you just want to get a higher wage, which I assume is on many of your mind right now, right? Many people go to college almost exclusively to get a better job than they would have if they didn't. And game theory is a wonderful way for us to study counterfactuals. What would you have done in different situations? What would you have done if you were a different version of yourself? And how does the interplay between what you did and what you would have done if you were the low type, those differences then have ramifications for what happens to you in the world that you're experiencing. Because it affects the muse. It affects the world's beliefs in response to what you do. So if you were playing that game, if that was your main goal at the moment, that's perfectly reasonable. I'm not telling you that isn't reasonable. Then I hope that today's lesson has a lot of bite for you. But I also hope that some of those pooling equilibria piss you off. Because I'm going to be honest with you. Because to be honest with you, as the world continues to improve on so many important dimensions, and I know sometimes it doesn't always feel like it is, but I think it is. As the world continues to improve, as the low capacity workers' output increases, it becomes easier and easier to pool. Those pooling equilibria become more and more common. And so if you were playing a game as if it was Spence's signaling model, then the current trajectory of the world indicates that you're nowhere close to enough education to distinguish yourself. Now that's kind of weird to think about, because here you are, you're at an excellent university, you're taking at least one hard class, I'm assuming you're taking lots of hard classes, you're putting in a lot of hours, you're paying a lot of costs, right? And again, that's the financial cost, which I don't want to diminish, but also think about all the time you're putting in. Think about every time that you watch one of these stupid videos, or every time you suffer through one of these stupid problem sets, or every time that you quite understandably wish that you could turn your headphones off when I'm bloviating at you like this. You're paying a lot of costs. Nevertheless, as the world continues to improve, pooling will become more and more likely. Which is to say, it will be harder and harder for you to distinguish yourself from other workers. So if that is your goal, which is totally reasonable, then it's going to be harder and harder for you to live up to that goal. That's just a warning, and that's in the model. Okay, so keep going. Don't stop right now. If your goal is to play like a Spencean worker of the high type, just keep going to school. Just keep going. Okay? Because you need to keep burning. You need to keep burning those calories in order for you to be able to distinguish yourself, for you to finally get to that point, that L times H minus L point, where the low type worker says, screw it, I'm not going to work that hard. I just got outworked. However, there are other ways to get something out of your education too. So it's easy for me to say because I'm a stupid college professor. But all of the details that we stripped out of the model to be able to tell you this interesting punchline about whether or not you can use education to send signals about what kind of worker you are or what kind of worker you're going to be. We stripped away all those beautiful details that rub my friend the wrong way. And I just hope that you know that your utility function can be, doesn't have to be, and I'm not telling you your utility function, but it can be about more than just the wage that you expect to get when you get out. I hope that there are moments where you learn something that you don't care how useful the thought is. I hope that there are moments where you learn something and you say, this isn't a means to an end thought. This is a thought worth relishing. This is a thought worth lingering on. Not because I think it's going to help me to get a better wage one day, or not even because I think it's going to transform me into a better person, which is possible too. But rather, I just f***ing love this. I just f***ing love this. You're allowed to think that. And I don't think that we tell you that enough. There's all these facts that we want you to know, and I get it. I totally get it. And we want you to get a great job and live a great, rewarding life and give lots of money back to the Robert J. Carroll Fund for teaching badly. There's all these things that we want you to do, and I want you to go live a wonderful, rewarding life in many ways. But because pooling is getting easier and easier and easier, I think that we need to shift our focus more and more toward lingering over the thoughts that are just beautiful, fun, sublime thoughts to think. I hope that your utility function isn't just your wage minus your costs, because if it is, then there might be some sad stories waiting for you at the end. There might be some terminal nodes that aren't so great. However, one way to buy insurance against that is to truly love some of the things that you do. Now, you're young. I'm not that old, but I'm older than you. And you might not yet have seen the thing that makes you stop and go, ooh. You might not have met that person yet. You might not have had that thought yet. You might not have taken that class yet. You might not have read that book yet. But you may one day. And I hope that whenever that happens, whenever you have that moment of resonance, whenever that thought comes, that you no longer give about whether it's a useful thought. The moment that idea comes, that you feel like a human. Make sure that that goes in your utility function. Make sure that you take note of it. Make sure that you write down the day and time. Because otherwise you're just going to be a Spencean player. And beautiful as this model is, and interesting as the punchline is, and beautiful, and it's so well set up. It's like a really good movie. It's just like, this model's like a really good movie, right? It has everything you need and nothing you don't. And that's good form of models, that's what they do. But just make sure that that rhetorical trick doesn't become something you over-internalize. Whenever you get that thought, write it down. Get a tattoo. I don't care. Just do something to note it. Remember it. And I think that for some of you, if you're anything like me, ironically enough, this model might be the thing that makes you feel that way. I remember thinking that. I remember thinking to myself as I watched my friend be a little bit annoyed by the model, and he got over it, don't get me wrong. But I remember thinking to myself, isn't it ironic that the thing that helps you to know that there's more to life than just how education relates to your wages is a model that shows you how your education relates to your wages? I think that's a big symbol about the introspection of social science. I hope that this has been something that meant something to some of you. But no matter what, of course, thanks for watching.